right now we have 3 panelists joining us. So it is my pleasure to introduce Olivier Charmeil, Executive Vice President for General Medicines at Sanofi, but also John Ryan from DG Santé, your Director of Public Health, Country Knowledge and Crisis Management, DG Santé European Commission, and finally Isabelle Becker-Ding, who is the Head of Division of Microbiology and at the Paul Ehrlich Institute. Thank you very much to the 3 of you for joining us this afternoon. You've heard the Commissioner speak, so we'll come back to some of these aspects. But before we go into a more specific aspect, Olivier, can I start with you? And well, let's say that the pharma company is a little bit under the spotlight these days for obvious reasons. First, there is the fact that the entire framework around industry, so the entire policy framework has changed in the past months. The world depends on pharma companies to deliver a cure and a vaccine to come over this pandemic. So can I ask you, and Sanofi has triggered this discussion today, so why was it important to you?
So thank you for inviting me to this important panel where we are going to frame what's the future of Europe, but also contribute to the global agenda. We thought at the beginning, from the early start, that given what we had ahead of us with COVID, this would not be a response of any institution. This had to be a collective response. And this is why we have encouraged every actors, every players to reflect on how we would get out of the pandemic. Academia, institution, we have been, of course, talking to our peers since the beginning, with the objective to try to find a collective response and to make sure that we would move fast in order to get out of this crisis. The second element is that, of course, in something that is new, you are not able to provide answers always the right way at the right speed. And we saw that it would be very important to draw lessons as we would be progressing so that in the future we would get definitely better prepared. So I very much agree with what the Commissioner for Health has just mentioned. If we step back, it's really impressive to see that what has been achieved in the last 12 months. As she said very eloquently, 12 months ago, no one knew exactly what was going on. And in the way, we have been able to get structured, to get organized, it's really impressive that we have been very, very reactive. And of course, the last 12 months have also shown some fragility, some signs of vulnerability in terms of preparedness. So we need to reflect on how we can get prepared better should there be a further crisis in the future. We have always been convinced since the beginning that we would need to build a different response and be better prepared to this crisis, and that public-private partnership would be very, very key. And this is why we have more than welcomed the initiative of the EU Commission mid-November, because we think that in order to foster the dialogue with the different actors, it would be absolutely critical that we get around the table and build an important dialogue. We are going to be at a period of time where the mandate of HERA is going to be discussed, the collaboration, how the public and private partnership can contribute to this discussion is of course very important. But we have to say that we have been very encouraged by the HERA incubator, which is definitely a first step. And our side, we are very keen, on co-designing what could be for the future an important element of the preparedness strategy.
Very good. Thank you. On January the 14th, we actually, Science Business, in partnership with Sanofi, organized a workshop called the Future HERA, What is at Stake? And we are actually releasing today, and during this panel, I mean, let's go now, we're releasing now a report with clear recommendations, or if not recommendations, those key questions that a group of 25 people from Europe, from outside of Europe, from industry, from research, from government, from foundations, wanted to address to policymakers, those who are shaping or will be shaping the future HERA. So, John, I hope you heard about this report, but it's actually, we are actually releasing really now. Your Deputy Director General, Pierre Delceau, was with us and made a very active contribution. And also with us back in January was Isabelle, who is here today with us, and she kindly agreed just to give a hint, just to give very short highlights of what were the conclusions of this report. I mean, up to you, Isabelle, just pick those 3-4 things that you thought were important, and then we'll open a debate to go deeper into some aspects. And during the debate, I will take questions from the audience. All right, so if you do have questions, you who are watching, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I will address them to the panelists. Isabelle, over to you.
So hello, and thank you for having me today. I am the chair of the IMI Scientific Committee, and as such, I've viewed and seen how the public-private partnership there has actually developed over the last years. And I think that was a very important basis for the discussion that we had, that was the basis for the report I'm going to try to summarize. Now, I think the major topics were, first of all, of course, what is HERA supposed to do? What is the strategy? What is the financing going to be? And there were many ideas on the table. What is clear is, I think, that it will have to be an institution that actually serves the member states and that is evidently participating and bringing new value to a new pandemic or to even this pandemic, depending on how long this lasts. And so similarly to BARDA, I think we all agreed that the major instrument will be public-private partnerships. Very different from what we see in IMI, which is in the pre-competitive area. So here we will really need programs and processes that will enable the agency and the EU actually to react to the pandemic crisis. In IMI, I think we learned that the program has been developed in a way that it was very agile and it was able to react to the Ebola crisis, it was able to react to COVID-19. And so I think there are some learnings that we can use. And so similarly, HERA has the opportunity to develop a new program or new processes on how to take up these learnings and make things happen. And I think what is important is that there will be synergies with the research programs of the European Commission, and that this will also help to drive a program that, of course, will not have the financial volume that a BARDA in the US has. Now, finally, we also looked, of course, at the aspect of transparency and would it be able to build trust? Because, of course, this is always something you encounter with public-private partnerships. And I think the solution was very evident that it's about communicating the needs, communicating what solutions are sought for, why, and that actually there is commitment of all the partners who are getting involved in this program. And so finally, we also discussed that there is commitment needed from the EU on a global level, and that, as we have learned with COVID-19, a pandemic is always an endeavor that cannot be solved by a single nation or a continent or a region, but that is actually involving all of us, and that the EU may be at the forefront of those taking responsibility in such a crisis.
Thank you, Isabelle. That was a very good summary. John, to do you want to react to those various points? I'd like specifically to come back on the public-private collaboration aspect, but on any other of the other topics, is there anything that you want to share with us now?
Yeah, maybe there's a good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. I wanted to bring a different angle maybe to the issue, which is for me a fundamental issue as well, and that's the need to have a solid framework in which you work. The discussion so far has largely focused around the gaps in availability of products or the difficulty of manufacturing products when you need them, and the pharmaceutical aspects, the pharmaceutical industry aspects, and we've just heard about the research angle. But I'd like to perhaps just highlight the need for a solid regulatory framework and also a solid member state framework, because you can manufacture all the drugs you want and you can produce all the research you want, but if there's not the capacity at the member states to actually absorb what you're doing at the European Union level, I think it's really a shame, because you're looking at one side of the pipeline but not the other. So if I might use that image. So I think Commissioner Kyriakides mentioned that the proposals that the Commission made for a European Union Health Union back in November last year had really four main pillars. The first pillar is a reform of our legislation on serious cross-border threats to health. One of the big gaps we identified as a result of our current experience, which is of course ongoing, is the topic of preparedness and how we engage with the member states to ensure that the levels of preparedness and capacity to react and to prepare for events is there. And this, we have legislation already from 2013, but I think our experience has been that the implementation of those regulations was lacking. And that's why one of the angles that we're trying to improve is the area of preparedness. But also I would mention the strengthening of the mandates of our two agencies, the ECDC and European Medicines Agency. And one of the aspects I'd like to mention there is the absolute impossibility of having a good radar screen during this whole event. So we've basically been begging the member states to produce sometimes even basic data, like the number of vaccines that have been delivered and, you know, the percentage of the vulnerable populations who have been vaccinated. It's very, very difficult at a common level to know what the state of play is on some very fundamental issues. And that's why this issue of data collection, data indicators, definition, and so on, is also one of the aspects we want to cover in this reform of our agency's legislation. So that's three parts, if you like. The fourth part is the HERA. Now, the HERA we'll talk about later, I guess, but I just wanted to say that I think it's a fundamental part of the puzzle, because you can have, of course, much better surveillance, alert systems, risk assessment, risk management, coordination. You can have every bit of that, you know, sort of perfectly in place. But if you don't have a flow of products through the pipeline, then you're in serious trouble. So for us, this is really an important part of the equation, having a strong legislative arrangement, having a good picture of what's going on, strengthening our agencies, and finally setting up a capacity for preparedness in the pharmaceutical field, which is absent at the moment. Thank you.
Very good. Can we just set ground rules here? Olivier, Isabelle, and John, three of you, I can see you. So if you want to jump in, react to whatever you hear, just do so. Okay, just raise your hand. I can see you. So although I'm in a studio, so please just go and let's try to make this discussion as dynamic as we can. One question about public-private partnership. John, you spoke about setting framework conditions, solid framework conditions, and it's actually a question I have for the three of you. We're moving towards new models of public-private partnerships. You're right, it's not only about HERA, it's also about the Health Union, the Health Union project plan. Overall, there are also new partnerships coming up with Horizon Europe. There are plenty of policy initiatives in health, the cancer beating plan, and the EU4Health Programme. So there's a lot happening, and across the board, it's the relationship between the public and the private sector that is changing at the European level. So the one question I wanted to ask is, how can the industry contribute more actively to setting up a long-term framework of action in the field of public health? All right, so this link between industry and public health. Who wants to go first?
So maybe I start. So first, and I'll talk about HERA, because of course this is going to be an important piece of the preparedness, and we need to build a response mechanism that is very solid, very agile. We need to make sure that we are going to talk about the mandate, and of course there are numerous players. John, you mentioned ECDC that are absolutely key, EMA. So how we make sure that all those players all those actors work together in order to make sure that we are very, very efficient. The second element, we know that public-private.
And I think we have lost Olivier. So who wants to? Isabelle, you go next, and Olivier will come back.
Yeah, maybe
Please.
I continue at that point. I think what is important is really to have a strategy to show that the systems will actually work in the crisis situation. So we will need structures that actually are ongoing, that are established in a way that there is audit processes, that there is working together in spite of peace times and absence of a pandemic, but where you are able to actually test these working relationships, to test the commitments, and to really understand what else you need to add, or which components, when you want to get this flowing in the pandemic. And I think a lot of thinking will have to be put into communication structures, for example, also on how things will follow sequentially, and what little things also need to be secured to make the whole thing working. And we have a lot of lessons from this ongoing pandemic, and I think it would be a waste not to use these and to, in a way, bring some sustainability into this and continue working on improving the framework, as you called it. And I think this is exactly what has to be very well planned.
Olivier, you're back with us.
Sorry, I got interrupted for 1 second.
No problem, just keep going.
Yeah, maybe two or three additional comments. We want to build a long-term framework because it's the only response to any potential crisis, which means that we need to have the right level of ambition. And Isabelle, you mentioned a little bit earlier, the right level of ambition, meaning also being realistic. I think HERA can play a very important role in those mechanisms through, of course, the definition of end-to-end approach. And we know that it's absolutely key that from research to development to manufacturing capabilities, there is a continuum that is well structured and very well organized. We know also that we need to accept to be very flexible, because HERA needs to be in a situation when there are specific gaps to be able to address them in a very agile way and without getting into too many complexities. And you mentioned a little bit earlier the importance of trust. I think trust from the general public is, of course, something that is very important, but also being able to develop this culture of collaboration, because all those actors will have to work together. So how we make sure that this partnership culture is deeply rooted in what we are trying to build.
Jen, do you want to come in here, both on this framework conditions to have to make also the this link between industry and public health, the role of the industry in public health stronger, but also the level of trust, since Olivier raised it.
Yeah. So let me say that in respect of the future HERA, we had a series of announcements, but we've actually gone out publicly with an inception impact assessment, which is bureaucratic speech for our initial ideas and concepts for a future HERA. And one of the issues which we talk about is the issue of public-private ecosystems. And I think it's really interesting to hear what I've been hearing now. The whole challenge really of developing trust and confidence between the different market players. And to do that, I would say, and this is probably the essential point, to do it in advance of the crisis rather than during the crisis. I think one of the worst experiences of my life so far has been to have tried to negotiate the purchase of personal protective equipment, ventilators, test kits, and all the other products, not to mention the therapeutics that we've been trying to procure, and of course the vaccines. Doing all this in the middle of a crisis is a recipe for trouble. And I think the whole idea of HERA is really to move the time frame forward so that we can work not only with industry, I would say, but also including industry. So we need to have a vision of where the challenges for the future will be in terms of major health threats. Secondly, we need to be able to prime and support the identification of suitable countermeasures, so pharmaceutical products, and then to have the manufacturing capacity to be able to manufacture those products in sufficient time to deal with the outbreak either in the European Union or somewhere else. Because you also have to consider that we may have to be in a position to actually project some of our solutions outside the European Union territory if it means stopping an outbreak. So, you know, it's one thing to talk about delivering vaccine to the European citizens as we're doing at the moment, but it would make a lot more sense if you have an outbreak of the type we're seeing in Guinea at the moment, if you were able to project some of your stockpiles or your products which have been developed through the HERA process to help those countries to control the outbreak at source. So there are many angles to this, but I think the industry is obviously in the middle of it all. And one of the other experiences which we highlight in the impact assessment document, which is published on the web, is the issue of a lack of any overview of the supply of medical countermeasures. I remember the phone calls we had to make, very urgent phone calls to different parts of the industry in order to figure out where the blockages were taking place last year in the supply of essential medical products. So I think the industry is a core player in all of this, the research community as well. And as I said before, the member states need to be in the loop from the very beginning.
But you raised in a very important point as well regarding the member states, and I touched upon that with the Commissioner, just asking about this reshuffling of competencies between the EU and member states. And okay, there is no change in the treaty needed, but it's not excluded in the future. But that would be my question here, is that with HERA, we're setting the ground for bigger competencies at the EU level, bigger competencies in health. Is it a model that we want to see become permanent? Do you think it's a good thing? And do you think that member states are ready for that?
Don't forget that when we published our impact assessment, we started by quoting the European Council. It's often a very good idea when you're on the Commission side if you can say, well, you know, the European Council were looking for this. And in fact, we have a quote from the European Council meeting, which took place in March 2020, where the Commission was called upon to continue and accelerate its efforts to help ensuring urgent and adequate provision of medical equipment throughout the EU, which is of the utmost priority. And there's more of similar quote if I were to continue. So I think the member states have collectively recognized that there is an issue regarding their state of preparedness. And as I said, dealing with that problem is not only a problem for HERA, it's a problem for having proper surveillance and alert systems in place in the European Union and elsewhere in the world. It's a question of being able to analyze the problem together in the form of a collective risk assessment, and then being able to coordinate the measures so we don't have people on one side making a decision on measures which are counterintuitive to what the scientific advice is. And we're seeing this very much at the moment. We're seeing that there is a lack of coherency and agreement on common measures. But then we need to have the same process, I think, in terms of stepping up our preparedness on the pharmaceutical side. And anybody who's been living through the last 12 months will realize that we have to learn lessons from this process. We are proposing something that we think is in the framework of our existing legal powers. But as the Commissioner said, there would be a discussion then on an extension of the competences on health as part of a wider discussion, as you mentioned, next year.
Very good. Thank you. Isabelle and Olivier, is that a good news for you?
I think so.
Yes. I have to say, you've got many hats, right? You're also part of an EMA task force, you're part of the IMI Scientific Council, and you're also an advisor to the German government. So, yeah, with all of that, tell us.
So, I think, you know, it's an interesting situation where we get away from risk mitigation to actually active engagement. And I think the underlying problem maybe is that we have to be very aware of that this requires understanding how many parts of the healthcare system in the member states actually work, and how maybe wonderful ideas that we could have on a European level can be implemented into the member states, and how that can really become true, and how that can become true maybe with less financial instruments that we may have after the Corona crisis. We have to think about it. And then again, really convincing the member states that this joint effort is worth it, that there is an added value, and that also if something like HERA would be built, that this agency will have the power to actually take over the responsibility, and who basically this agency would be reporting to. And it's again, like I mentioned earlier, for working together in a public-private partnership, again here, it's the same issue. It's about trust and having very good strategies, but then again, you know, being realistic and what is feasible and what really will work in the crisis situation. And I think that is still something that we will have to go back and look into the different member states and understand what was going on, what went well, what went wrong. And this will be very different from country to country. And I think that's the beauty of Europe, but it's also something we have to add as an element to the thinking of how you can grow such a new body.
Isabelle, do you have an advice for the Commission on how to sell this idea of grown competency in the long run, how to sell that to member states? Sell the idea.
I think the idea is really to build trust. What we've learned, because I'm also in charge of supply shortages in Germany, is that indeed, you know, it is important to visualize that as the EU, we have a huge population of something like 400 million people. As a single country, you have much less. So it's also easier sometimes to negotiate and to plan and to forecast demand. And similarly, I think there would be clear advantages of this joint venture. And I think we're already, I mean, think about how far we've come if you look back for 20 years. And now maybe this is the next step. and we have some understanding of how EMA functions, how ECDC functions. So if we take some learnings from there and build a good strategy that convinces the member states, I think everybody will probably be very, very much willing to agree and to contribute with their part, because as far as I understand, it's also not very clear whether there will be also what the role of the member states would be within this agency.
Jan, did you want to come back in?
Yeah, I was just a little bit provoked by Isabel there, because in fact she was saying many of the things I've been saying. The only remark I would make is I think Isabel was talking about procuring in an emergency. I think the whole idea is not to procure in an emergency, but to try and do as much as you can, have the contracts ready, you know, the mock-up contracts ready in advance, have the orders ready in advance, have your planning prepared in advance, if necessary, have a store of money somewhere in advance. But the whole idea, I would say, you know, if I wanted to put it simply, is to move away from doing it in the middle of a pandemic and to try and do it a little bit before, even if it's a half an hour, 2 days or 3 days or 3 months or whatever is possible, that we try and advance this preparedness and as many aspects as we can. You remember when we had the SARS outbreak, a follow-up to that was a commission proposal that there should be a central stockpile of Tamiflu.
Tamiflu. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I remember being during the German presidency at that time, whatever year it was. I remember being in an informal health council in Aachen, where 50% of the member states wanted an EU stockpile and 50% didn't want an EU stockpile. So the Commission withdrew its proposal from the table. And the next adventure was pandemic flu in 2009, when the Council called on the Commission as a result of trying to procure pandemic flu vaccines 28 times, decided it might be a better idea if we tried to combine our efforts. And they actually asked the Commission to set up the joint procurement mechanism. And that was the second stage of the development of this concept. The third stage is the current event, where we have been jointly procuring all sorts of products, but we've been doing it in the middle of the pandemic. And all I'm saying is that that's not a good approach. So I'm not really so concerned about, you know, the legal competences and, you know, what I'm trying to do is to try and imagine a solution to the problem. And I think we can find a legal or financial envelope for that, respecting everybody's wishes. But the whole point is we shouldn't find ourselves in the same situation again without having learned some lessons. So putting it very simply, that's where I'm coming from.
Okay.
Maybe
yes,
John,
Olivier.
building on your comments, and of course I'm not competent to make any to have any view on the competence between the member state and Europe. But what is absolutely critical is that there is a clear alignment in terms of European agenda, and it's definitely about making sure that we are in the middle of the pandemic, that in Europe we have the right level of investments in terms of getting access to capacity, that we invest well in advance in order to be able to cope with any crisis. And here I'm very much on this technology. So in the current phase, it's making sure that we get access to the different technology that will allow us to respond to the crisis. There is, of course, a second dimension, which is more related to industrial capabilities. No company, we are, of course, and you mentioned it also, Isabel, we are in Europe, we have 400 million population, but we also at some point want to play a role outside of Europe. So making sure that we build the right industrial capabilities is, of course, very key, which, of course, has some consequence, because it's not only about being able to fund, you know, those manufacturing capabilities, but it's also making sure that we build the right competencies in terms of skills of staff that will be able to manufacture, of course, very complex processes. So again, what is critical on the agenda is of essence.
Thank you, Olivier, and it's great that you're bringing the international dimension in it and the role of the EU in the world, because I would like now to welcome, it's a pre-recorded message from him, but the Director General from the World Health Organization, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, did want to contribute to that discussion. So although he couldn't be here live, he did send a short message that I will invite my colleague to play now, please.
Esteemed guests, dear colleagues and friends, the COVID-19 pandemic is a powerful demonstration that necessity is truly the mother of invention. This unprecedented crisis has generated unprecedented innovation. Vaccines and diagnostics have been developed in record time, supported by revolutionary technologies and innovative public-private partnerships. With the support of European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, WHO and partners formed the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, an innovative partnership that aims to match the urgency with which vaccines have been developed with the urgency to distribute them equitably to all countries. The pandemic is highlighting the synergies and strengths between science and business, but also some of the tensions. So far, more than 180 million doses of vaccine have been administered. More than half are in just 2 countries. More than 200 countries are yet to administer a single dose. Innovation has always been at the heart of progress in public health. Think of vaccines, penicillin, or the mapping of the human genome. Innovation is helping us respond to the pandemic, and innovation must be a key part of the global recovery. But science and technology alone will not save us. They are tools that can widen inequalities or narrow them, depending on how we use them and who can access them. WHO is committed to working with partners across the public and private sectors to harness the power of research and innovation for all people, and to work together for a healthier, safer, fairer world. I thank you.
Very good. Can I invite the 3 of you actually to react to what we just heard from Tedros? What do you think should be the role of the EU in health emergency situation? Who wants to go first?
Okay, so maybe I start. Science, I like very much what he said, in a sense that science and technology are only tools. And at the end of the day, it's our ability, to apply lessons from what we have been learning in the last few months that will allow us to be better prepared, to be better mobilized when next time a crisis of that kind is going to happen. I think we need to make sure that I'm optimistic. Of course, there are variants that are showing up a little bit all over the place, but I'm optimistic, and I think within a reasonable period of time, we are going to get out of this COVID crisis. But the question is how we make sure that we draw the lessons in terms of preparedness of what we have experienced. It is obvious that HERA is, of course, an important milestone. I think it's an important milestone for the Europe population in order to make sure that we are better prepared next time things happen. But we see that Europe is playing a much important role, and that we are expecting, of course, to play an important role on the global scene. And John, you mentioned a little bit earlier in the discussion the strategic importance of the regulatory framework. And I think here Europe has to play an important role on the global scene, because we know that the better the framework is is aligned, I wouldn't say harmonized, the better, the most efficient the system can be. So I think, for the future, we need probably to get better prepared and not regard, any healthcare expenses as an expenses, but really think that it's an investment for the future and move towards more preventive healthcare, because definitely I think more attention and more focus on prevention will allow us to build a healthier Europe.
Who wants to come next? Well,
I can go.
Yes, and just why does international cooperation matter?
I think because the most important thing is really to be able to have access to all these innovations. And I think it'll be important to actually foster, first of all, translation in the EU. We have excellent research where we can still improve translation, but then all this innovation can foster progress in beyond the EU. And I think the question where we really have to work on there is accessibility and how we make this innovation available beyond the EU. And this is where I think that fostering collaborations and strategic partnerships could be very helpful and could also, of course, be part of what HERA could be looking at in peace times, again, because I do see this advantage.
Okay. John, coming back specifically about HERA, so that's one thing also that came out of the workshop we had a month ago, is what should be the level of cooperation between HERA and BARDA, for instance. What do you think should be the role of the EU in terms of crisis, and specifically what should be the role of HERA in the world?
Yeah, so it's not, the question is not the role of the EU in the crisis, because I mean, the whole idea of HERA is to do something before you have a crisis. So these two are two different issues for me. But I'd just like to go back to what Tedros was saying, Dr. Tedros was saying from WHO. It emphasizes for me the key role of the WHO. Now I know that the role of the WHO has been subject to criticism. But I think the position of the European Union has been that we need to reinforce the international organizations and instruments which we have. And I'm not saying this in an idle way. We led the global health community during the last health assembly of the WHO, which is, if you like, the international parliament of the World Health Organization. We brought countries together around a single resolution on the strengthening of WHO. Strong arrangements and strong agreements in place, whether it's for getting the alert as quickly as we can, getting samples of a new virus or a new threat as quickly as we can. We have to have common trust, as we were saying earlier on, Isabella was saying earlier on, the key importance is that we have relationships which are developed between countries, and that we don't have what we see currently, which is vaccine diplomacy, which is really the most abject form of diplomacy I think has ever been invented. It's really trying to score points based on people's misery and on the lack of access. So I think if HERA can play a role in strengthening the international preparedness and building on these tools which we have there already and which need really to be operationalized, it would be a step in the right direction.
Very good. I think this is a very nice way to end this discussion. And I promise that Science Business will look into the vaccine diplomacy topic in not too long. This is actually a very important topic. I think we've reached the end of this session, and I'd like to thank you very much to the three of you and Dr. Tedros as well for contributing to this discussion, which has been extremely rich.